The wedding hall shimmered with chandeliers, each crystal catching the light like scattered stars. Guests whispered curiously as the three identical boys, dressed in miniature tuxedos, their mischievous eyes sparkling, rushed down the aisle. They stopped in front of the tall, composed groom, tugged on his sleeve, and in perfect unison called out, "Dad!" The crowd gasped. Cameras flashed. For a heartbeat, silence pressed over the hall, then a ripple of laughter and murmurs followed. The CEO, Alexander Knight, usually a fortress of discipline and composure, froze. His piercing blue eyes softened as he looked down at the triplets, who smiled with a genius boldness far beyond their age. The bride's mother, seated in the front row, clutched her pearls in shock. Her lips trembled, trying to process what had just happened. The CEO's grandmother, however, beamed with delight. Her fragile hands clapped together, eyes twinkling with joy, as if she had just been given the most precious gift she had long prayed for. Alexander bent down slowly, his sharp jawline brushing against the delicate curls of one of the boys as he whispered, "Why are you calling me that?" The oldest triplet grinned slyly. "Because you're the one who makes Mommy smile." A hushed wave of emotion swept through the audience. The bride, Amelia, blushed crimson, torn between embarrassment and the undeniable warmth swelling in her chest. She had never told Alexander about the triplets' secret plan. Yet here they were, boldly weaving themselves into his heart in front of the world. As the ceremony continued, Alexander couldn't take his eyes off Amelia. The memories of their first meeting rushed back, how she had stood against him in the boardroom, fearless, with her fiery arguments and determined gaze. The walls he had built over years of being untouchable had cracked then, but now, with these three little boys anchoring themselves to his soul, he felt them shatter entirely. Later, under the canopy of roses as vows were exchanged, Alexander's voice trembled for the first time in his life. He promised not only to love Amelia, but to protect and cherish the three bright stars who had dared to claim him as their father. The grandmother wept tears of pure joy, while the mother, still in disbelief, struggled with the reality that her daughter had not only captured the heart of one of the world's most powerful men, but had brought him into a family already bursting with unexpected love. After the ceremony, when the music slowed and the dance floor glowed with soft golden lights, Alexander pulled Amelia close. His hand rested firmly on her waist, drawing her in until their foreheads touched. "You've changed everything," he whispered, his breath warm against her lips. She shivered, heart racing as his other hand brushed back a strand of her hair. "They called you Dad," she murmured, her voice caught between apology and laughter. "And I didn't correct them," Alexander replied, his tone low, deliberate, and filled with unspoken promise. His lips found hers, slow and tender at first, then deepening into a kiss that silenced every whisper around them. The triplets clapped and cheered, and the grandmother laughed so hard tears ran down her face. But beneath the laughter and romance, shadows lingered. The mother's eyes narrowed, her thoughts clouded with doubt. She couldn't shake the question. Had Alexander really accepted them all, or was he playing a role too perfect to trust? The night sparkled with romance and celebration, yet the story had only just begun. The music carried through the hall like a spell, weaving joy and disbelief together in a melody that no one would ever forget. Amelia leaned against Alexander's chest, her heart beat wild as though it wanted to leap out and confess everything she had hidden all these years. His arms, strong and commanding, enclosed her in a way that made her feel both fragile and invincible at the same time. The world, for that fleeting moment, dissolved into nothing but the warmth of his touch and the rhythm of their breathing. Yet the stares of the guests pressed in on them. Some looked enchanted, others curious, a few scandalized. Amelia's mother, still stiff in her seat, seemed torn between pride and shock. Her eyes flickered between her daughter, radiant in Alexander's embrace, and the three boys who had, without hesitation, called him Dad. She had known her daughter was guarding a secret, but she had not anticipated it would unfold so boldly, so publicly. Alexander's hand trailed down Amelia's back as he guided her gracefully across the dance floor. "They're extraordinary," he murmured into her ear, nodding discreetly toward the triplets who were now showing off their cleverness by charming the bridesmaids and entertaining the younger guests with riddles. "You never told me how brilliant they are." Her lips trembled, caught between a confession and a fear that everything might crumble if she revealed too much too soon. They've always been ahead of their time. They see the world differently," she whispered, her voice carrying both pride and worry. "Sometimes too differently." Alexander's gaze deepened. His hand tilted her chin upward, forcing her eyes to meet his. "Then I will see the world as they do," he said simply, and the sincerity in his tone made her throat tighten with emotion. The grandmother, meanwhile, rose from her seat with surprising vigor, cane forgotten, and made her way toward the boys. She crouched slowly, smiling at them with all the affection in her aged heart. "Do you know," she said softly, "you've given me the greatest joy tonight. Calling my grandson Dad was the most beautiful wedding gift I could ever imagine." The boys grinned, one of them boldly kissing her hand. She laughed, her frail shoulders shaking, and she whispered something only they could hear, words that made their eyes widen with intrigue and delight. Amelia noticed the exchange and wondered what secret her grandmother had entrusted to them. A shiver of both excitement and apprehension ran through her. The family was binding itself together faster than she had ever expected. Later, when the hall quieted and couples drifted to the garden under the moonlit night, Alexander found himself sitting on the stone balustrade with Amelia beside him. The scent of roses filled the air. The laughter of the triplets echoed faintly in the distance as they chased fireflies across the lawn. Alexander studied Amelia, the glow of lanterns catching in her eyes. "You've always been a mystery," he said, his voice lower now, heavy, with longing. "You fought me like no one else ever dared in the boardroom. You challenged me, infuriated me, but I couldn't stop thinking about you. And now, here you are, in my arms, with three boys who've claimed me as theirs. Tell me, Amelia, do you trust me enough to let me in?" Her breath caught. She had long built walls of her own, afraid that revealing the truth too soon would scare him away, or worse, shatter the fragile happiness they had just begun to build. But his eyes, those stormy, commanding eyes, looked at her not with suspicion, but with a devotion she hadn't thought possible. She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear. "I don't know how you'll react if I tell you everything," she confessed. "But I want to believe that tonight is the beginning of something real. For me, and for them." His hand slid to the small of her back, pulling her closer. "Then believe it," he murmured before capturing her lips in another kiss. This one deeper, more consuming, filled with the hunger of a man who had been starved of love for far too long. Amelia melted against him, her fingers tangling in, his hair surrendering to the fire that burned between them. A sudden interruption came in the form of tiny footsteps. The eldest triplet stood before them, his expression far too serious for a boy his age. "We need to talk," he announced. Amelia pulled back, startled, while Alexander raised a brow in amusement. The boy climbed onto the balustrade beside them. "We've been thinking," he said with a sharp intelligence that seemed to pierce the night. "If you're going to be our dad, you have to prove it." Alexander chuckled softly, intrigued. "And how do you suggest I do that?" The boy crossed his arms. "By protecting Mommy. Always. Not just with words, with actions." His tone was firm, almost like a miniature reflection of Alexander himself. Amelia gasped softly, reaching to hush her son, but Alexander held up a hand. He bent down, eye level with the child, and nodded. I give you my word. No harm will come to her or to any of you as long as I breathe. The boy studied him intently, then smiled, satisfied, and hopped down to run back to his brothers. Amelia watched the exchange with tears in her eyes. Something about the solemnity of the vow and the way Alexander had delivered it made her believe, for the first time, that perhaps her fears could finally rest. But just as the moment softened, the shadow of doubt returned. Amelia's mother appeared, in the garden, her face stern, her voice sharp. Alexander, she said firmly, you may have charmed everyone tonight, but promises made in the glow of music and wine are easy. Tomorrow reality will demand answers. Are you truly prepared to carry this family, with all its complications, into your empire? The words hung in the night air, heavy and cold. Alexander's jaw tightened, his arm wrapping protectively around Amelia. The grandmother, who had followed slowly behind, placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder and whispered, Sometimes the heart leads where logic never dares. Don't let fear steal this moment. Amelia trembled, torn between the doubt in her mother's eyes and the certainty in Alexander's touch. The triplets' laughter rang again in the distance, innocent and free, as though unaware of the storm that brewed beneath the beauty of this night. And as the moon cast its silver light upon them all, it became clear that their story was only just beginning, balanced delicately between love, trust, and the trials yet to come. The garden seemed to hold its breath, the lantern swaying gently, in the night breeze, as if waiting for Alexander's response. His hand tightened around Amelia's waist, anchoring her as though he feared she might vanish if he let go. His eyes locked onto her mother's, steady and unyielding, a storm of pride and defiance simmering beneath the surface. I don't make promises I can't keep, he said at last, his voice quiet but powerful, each syllable laced with authority, that came not from his wealth or status, but from the certainty of his heart. If I take Amelia's hand, I take her world too. Every joy, every struggle, every secret she holds close. That is what marriage means to me. The mother hesitated, her lips parting as if to argue, but something in his tone, something unshakable, stole the words from her throat. She turned her gaze toward Amelia, searching for doubt, for hesitation, but instead found her daughter's eyes glowing with a strength she had never seen before. Amelia stood taller, leaning into Alexander, not as a woman rescued, but as a woman who had chosen. The grandmother's frail smile deepened, her eyes moist with satisfaction. I always knew, she whispered softly, that he would be the one to break the curse of loneliness in this family. I can see it in the way he holds. You, child, that is not ambition speaking, that is love. Amelia felt her chest swell with warmth, but she was not naive. Love was a fragile thing in a world like theirs, and the more precious it was, the more dangerous the forces that sought to destroy it became. She turned her face into Alexander's chest, inhaling the faint scent of his cologne, grounding herself in his presence. His hand caressed the back of her head gently, as if he sensed the storm of fear that stirred within her. From across the lawn, the triplets suddenly came running, their laughter piercing through the heavy silence. The youngest clutched something in his tiny hand, a folded paper crumpled from play. He thrust it toward Alexander with a triumphant grin. Look, Dad, we made a contract! Alexander raised an eyebrow, accepting the paper. He unfolded it, carefully, revealing childish scrawls and uneven lines. At the top, in large block letters, it read, Dad Agreement. Beneath it were 3 shaky signatures, each one belonging to the boys, and a set of conditions written with adorable seriousness. Must protect Mommy. Must play with us. Must never leave. Must make pancakes on Sundays. A ripple of laughter burst. Through the group, even from Amelia's mother, whose stern mask cracked despite herself. Alexander read each line with solemnity, then crouched down before the boys, meeting them eye to eye. "Gentlemen," he said with mock gravity, "this is the most important contract I have ever been asked to sign." He pulled a pen from his jacket pocket, signed his name at the bottom with a flourish, and handed it back. "Consider it sealed." The triplets erupted in cheers, jumping into his arms, clinging to his neck and shoulders with the fierce loyalty only children could give. So quickly, Emilia watched, her throat tight with emotion, her vision blurred with unshed tears. She had feared this moment for so long, afraid of rejection, afraid that the man she loved would see her family as a burden. But instead, he had embraced them, fully as though he had been waiting all his life to belong to them. The music from the hall drifted faintly into the garden again, a waltz slow and intoxicating. Alexander set the boys down and turned back to Emilia, his gaze burning with desire that no words could mask. He pulled her close once more, his lips brushing against hers with the barest hint of restraint. "I don't care who doubts us," he murmured, his voice husky. "This, you, them, us. It's mine now, and I don't let go of what's mine." Her heart hammered in her chest, the world blurring around them. She kissed him back, fierce and desperate, her fingers gripping his lapel as if to anchor herself to the truth of his words. The kiss deepened, her body melting into his as the night air wrapped them in secrecy. For a moment, she felt utterly consumed, the weight of all her fears dissolving into the fire that burned between them. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "Tell me everything," he whispered. "No more secrets." Emilia's lips parted, but before she could speak, her mother's voice cut through again, gentler this time, though edged with worry. "Alexander, love is not enough. The world you live in, the business, the enemies you've made, the power you hold, it will test them. It will test all of you. Are you ready for that?" He turned his head slowly toward her, his arm never leaving Emilia's waist. "I've fought wars in boardrooms, endured betrayals, and faced enemies with far more power than most men will ever know. But none of it prepared me for the way these four people." His gaze swept over Emilia, and "The boys make me feel. That terrifies me more than any rival could. And that is how I know it's real." The grandmother clapped her hands softly, as if blessing the words. The triplets ran back again, now tugging on Alexander's arm. "Come dance with us, Dad," they shouted, their energy relentless. With a grin rare and unguarded, Alexander scooped one boy into his arms, held the hands of the other two, and allowed himself to be dragged back toward the glowing hall. Emilia followed, her heart soaring as she watched him laugh, a sound so rare, so genuine, that it filled her with hope. But as they stepped back into the glittering light of the reception, Emilia's gaze caught on a figure lurking near the entrance, watching them with narrowed eyes. A man in a dark suit, unfamiliar yet unsettling, his stare fixed on Alexander with a cold intensity that made her blood run cold. She slipped her hand into Alexander's without a word, forcing a smile for the children. But in her chest, unease coiled tightly. She knew this happiness was fragile, balanced on the edge of forces that neither love nor vows could easily protect them from. The night was theirs for now, radiant and breathtaking, but somewhere beyond the glow of chandeliers and laughter, a shadow had already begun to stir. The figure at the entrance lingered like a shadow, unmoving, his eyes tracking every step Alexander and Emilia took. For a moment, Emilia thought she had imagined it, that her mind was playing tricks on her after such an overwhelming day. But as the man shifted ever so slightly, the light from the chandeliers grazed his face, sharp and severe, and a chill ran down her spine. Alexander, oblivious for the moment, was pulled onto the dance floor by the triplets. They laughed as they tried to spin him around, their tiny arms clinging to his hands. He allowed himself to stumble along with them, his polished shoes sliding against the marble floor as he let out a genuine laugh that made the entire hall turn their heads in surprise. Guests who knew him as the unshakable CEO, the man who never allowed himself to be vulnerable, watched in disbelief as he surrendered to the carefree joy of children. Amelia's heart swelled at the sight, but her unease didn't fade. Her eyes darted toward the doorway again. The man was gone. A prickle of dread lingered, whispering that whoever he was, he hadn't come merely to watch. She pressed her fingers against her gown, forcing herself to focus on the music, on the warmth radiating from the people she loved. When the song ended, Alexander swept Amelia into his arms, spinning her gently as the triplets clapped and cheered. He set her down, his lips brushing her temple, his voice low. "You're trembling." She tried to smile, but the words caught in her throat. Everything feels so perfect tonight, and I'm afraid it won't last." He tilted her face up, his gaze burning into hers. "It will last because I will make it last. Do you understand me? Nothing and no one will take this from us." She wanted to believe him, wanted to cling to the promise in his voice, but the shadow in the doorway still haunted her thoughts. Before she could say more, the triplets interrupted again, tugging at their hands. "Come on, Mommy! Come on, Dad! Let's dance together!" And so, under the shimmer of lights, they danced as a family for the first time. The boys twirled between them, their laughter echoing louder than the music, their joy infectious enough to draw even the stiffest of guests onto the floor. The grandmother joined, too, her frail frame moving with surprising rhythm as she clapped along, while Amelia's mother watched from the side, her expression unreadable, a storm of emotions flickering in her eyes. Later, when the crowd settled, to dine and chatter resumed, Alexander led Amelia toward the balcony overlooking the city skyline. The night stretched endlessly before them, stars scattered like diamonds across velvet. He pulled her close, his arm wrapping firmly around her waist. "I want to know everything," he said quietly, his voice laced with determination. "About them. About you. No more walls, Amelia. If we're going to build this life, I need the whole truth." She hesitated, staring down at the sparkling streets below. "I never meant to keep secrets from you," she whispered. "But I was afraid that the moment you knew the full story, you'd walk away. And I couldn't bear that, not for me and not for them." His fingers brushed her cheek, tender and unyielding all at once. "I'm not walking away. Whatever it is, I'll carry it with you." Her throat tightened, her heart racing as memories surged. The lonely nights, the difficult choices, the strength she had to summon when no one else was there. Her lips parted to speak, but a sharp sound behind them interrupted the moment. A faint crack, like glass splintering. Alexander spun instantly, his instincts razor-sharp. At the far end of the balcony, the shadowed figure appeared again, watching. This time Alexander saw him too. The man didn't move, didn't speak. His presence was a silent threat, heavy and suffocating. Alexander's body tensed, his jaw clenched, as he positioned himself between Amelia and the intruder. For a long, taut moment, the two men stared at one another, the air charged with unspoken challenge. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, the figure melted back into the darkness, leaving nothing but the echo of his absence. Amelia's fingers gripped Alexander's arm. "Who was that?" she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't know," Alexander admitted, though his voice was steady. "But I intend to find out. No one comes this close to me without reason, and no one threatens what's mine." He pulled her into his chest, his embrace protective, his eyes scanning, the night as though daring the shadows to return. For the first time, Emilia understood the sheer power behind his presence, not just the authority of a CEO, but the steel of a man who would lay down everything to defend the people he loved. When they returned inside, the atmosphere of the hall seemed lighter to everyone else, but to Emilia it felt as though danger lingered just beyond the edges of the golden light. The triplets, however, remained blissfully unaware, their clever little minds preoccupied with plotting games and whispering secrets to one another. She envied their innocence, their ability to believe that the world was as simple as love and laughter. As the night stretched on, Alexander never strayed far from Emilia's side. He danced when she asked, laughed when the boys pulled him into their antics, and even shared quiet words with her grandmother that made the old woman beam with pride. Yet beneath it all, a storm brewed in his eyes, a quiet vow that no one would dare harm the family he had just claimed. When the guests began to depart and the hall grew quieter, Emilia found herself standing once more at the edge of the dance floor, watching Alexander with the triplets. He crouched low, his sleeves rolled up, listening intently as the boys whispered some new scheme into his ear. He laughed, a sound deep and rich, filled with a warmth she had never imagined from him. Her mother approached, her steps hesitant, her face softer now. She touched Emilia's arm gently. "I still worry," she admitted. "But when I see the way he looks at you, and the way those boys look at him, perhaps this is something even I cannot deny." Emilia's throat tightened. She looked at her mother, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," she whispered, "but tonight, I believe." Her mother squeezed her hand, her gaze shifting to Alexander, and for once there was no judgment in her eyes, only reluctant acceptance. Across the room, Alexander straightened, catching Emilia's gaze. For a heartbeat, the noise and the crowd faded, leaving only the intensity of his stare and the unspoken promise it carried. He extended his hand toward her, commanding without words. She moved to him, her steps light, her heart heavy and soaring all at once. When she reached him, he pulled her close, his lips brushing her ear. "No more fear," he whispered. "You're mine. They're mine. And whoever was watching tonight will learn what that means." The triplets clung to them, laughter still bubbling, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. And as Emilia buried her face against Alexander's chest, she knew that their love story had only just stepped into its most dangerous and breathtaking chapter. The last of the guests drifted out into the cool night air, their laughter fading as car doors closed and engines purred away. The grand hall, once brimming with chatter and music, was left hushed, the chandeliers glowing softly like watchful stars. Emilia stood near the tall windows, her hand resting against the cold glass as she gazed out at the moonlit garden, where, only hours ago, laughter and promises had filled the air. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and uncertain, though her heart still carried the warmth of Alexander's words. Behind her, footsteps echoed steadily across the polished floor. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. His presence filled a space before he even spoke. Alexander came up behind her, his arm sliding naturally around her waist, pulling her gently into him. His lips brushed her hair as he murmured, "I can feel your thoughts racing." She leaned into him, grateful for the solid weight of his arm. "I can't shake the feeling that tonight wasn't just about us. Someone was watching, Alexander. Someone with intent." His jaw tensed against her temple. "I saw him, too. Whoever he is, he's not part of my world. Not directly. If he were, I'd know. Which means..." His voice dipped lower, more dangerous. "He belongs to someone who doesn't want this union to exist." Emilia shivered, the words settling like ice in her stomach. She turned to face him, her fingers brushing along his chest, her eyes pleading. "Promise me you'll be careful. It's not just you anymore. It's us. It's them." His gaze softened at the mention of the triplets. He tilted her chin up with one hand, the other resting firmly at her back. "I swore to your son tonight, Emilia. I don't break oaths. Whatever shadows come for us, they'll find I'm not a man to be underestimated." His kiss sealed the vow, slow and steady, yet brimming with an intensity that made her knees weaken. Just beyond the hall, muffled giggles spilled down the corridor. The triplets, still wide awake despite the late hour, tumbled into view. Their matching suits were wrinkled now, ties askew, yet their energy hadn't faded. "We're not tired," one declared, while the other two chimed in. "Tell us a story." "Dad!" Alexander smirked, crouching down to their level. "A story? Do you know how many stories I've conquered in my life? Most of them didn't end well for the men who challenged me." His tone was playful, but his eyes gleamed as the boys leaned in eagerly. Emilia's laughter bubbled out despite her worry. Watching the three little geniuses climb into Alexander's lap, hanging on his every word, made something inside her ache with tenderness. He spoke to them not as if they were children to be placated, but as equals to be respected. His story was simple yet captivating, filled with castles and cunning princes who overcame battles with their minds rather than swords. The boys hung, onto every word, their bright eyes reflecting the flickering glow of the chandeliers. By the time he finished, their lids had grown heavy. One rested his head on Alexander's shoulder, another curled against his chest, while the third held his hand tightly even in sleep. Emilia's heart nearly broke at the sight. It was a picture she had dreamed of, but never thought she would see. She approached quietly, her hand brushing his arm. "You're a natural with them," she whispered. He glanced up at her, his expression soft in a way she doubted anyone else in the world had ever seen. "I never had a father worth remembering," he admitted, his voice low. "But maybe I can be the man for them that I needed when I was their age." Her breath caught, emotion swelling too thick to speak. She bent to kiss his forehead, her lips lingering against his skin, tasting the salt of his quiet confession. For a fleeting second, the danger of the night dissolved, leaving only the fragile, breathtaking beauty of what they were building together. When the boys were finally carried off to bed by the staff, Alexander led Emilia to the grand staircase. The house was quiet now, the echoes of the evening fading into silence. He stopped midway up, pulling her back against the wall, his body pressing into hers with a hunger that had been restrained all night. "Do you know?" he murmured against her lips. "How hard it's been not to steal you away this entire evening. Every time you smiled, every time you looked at me with those eyes, I wanted the world to vanish so you'd be mine alone." Her pulse raced as his mouth traced along her jawline, down to the hollow of her throat. She clutched his shoulders, gasping softly, her body arching into his touch. "Alexander," her whisper was half a plea, half surrender. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her as though she weighed nothing, his lips never leaving her skin. Each kiss was deeper, more urgent, unraveling the defenses she had built over years. In his arms, she was not the cautious mother nor the guarded woman. She was simply his, and nothing else mattered. But even in the haze of their passion, a flicker of unease lingered. The man in the shadows, the watchful gaze, the unspoken threats, they weren't gone. Somewhere beyond the safety of Alexander's embrace, forces were moving, forces that might already be planning to shatter the fragile world they had created, tonight. And yet, as Alexander carried her toward the sanctuary of their room, his words echoed in her mind. "No more fear. You're mine. They're mine." Emilia closed her eyes, pressing her face into his chest, clinging to the strength of his heartbeat. For tonight, she allowed herself to believe in him completely. Whatever storms lay ahead, she knew he would stand at the front, of them, unyielding, fierce, and hers. In the silence of the mansion, beneath the weight of love and danger intertwined, their story pressed forward, unstoppable, with every step drawing them closer to a future as uncertain as it was irresistible. The grand corridors of the mansion were bathed in a soft golden glow, the sconces casting shadows that stretched and shifted as Alexander carried Amelia in his arms. Her breath came in quick, shallow waves, her hands looped around his neck, her gaze fixed on him as though the world could collapse and she would still be safe in his hold. His stride was strong, unhurried, each step echoing with the certainty of a man who owned not just the empire beyond those walls, but also the fragile, beating heart pressed against him. When they reached his chamber, Alexander pushed the door, open with his shoulder, the polished wood swinging silently on its hinges. The room was expansive, dominated by tall windows where moonlight spilled in silver streams across the polished floor. Heavy curtains framed the glass like watchful guardians, while the fire in the hearth crackled softly, throwing warmth into the vast space. He set her down gently, as though she were something delicate yet infinitely precious. For a long moment, they simply stood in the center of the room, the silence wrapping around them like an intimate cocoon. His hands stayed at her waist, fingers splayed, holding her close. Her chest rose and fell, her lips parted, words trembling on the edge of release. "Alexander," she whispered, "I never thought I would see this day. Not with you. Not with them. And yet—" He silenced her with a kiss, slow at first, but deepening as though years of restraint had broken at once. His lips tasted of promise and hunger, of everything he had never allowed himself to crave. She melted against him, her hands sliding across, his broad shoulders anchoring herself in the storm of his touch. When he finally pulled back, his breath was uneven, his voice husky. "You don't have to think anymore. You just have to feel. With me." She shivered as his fingers traced the line of her arm, brushing her skin with the gentlest of touches, yet igniting fire beneath it. Her gown, heavy with silk and lace, rustled as he guided her toward the edge of the bed. She sat, her eyes never leaving his, her heart pounding wildly. The power in his gaze was undeniable, but there was vulnerability there too, an almost desperate need to claim her, to be claimed in return. He crouched before her, his hand lifting her chin. "You've been alone too long, Amelia, carrying the weight of everything, hiding behind strength because you had no choice. But you're not alone anymore. Do you hear me?" His voice cracked slightly, the control he wielded with the world, faltering only for her. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow but of release. She nodded, pressing her forehead against his. "I hear you, and I want to believe it more than anything." Their lips met again, urgent now, desperate. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her onto his lap as if he couldn't bear even an inch of distance. She clung to him, feeling the raw intensity of his love and desire, every kiss searing her deeper into the truth of what they were. The firelight flickered, painting them in shades of gold and shadow, while outside the night carried on, indifferent, to the intimacy burning within these walls. But even as passion consumed them, a subtle unease lingered at the edges of her mind. She thought of the shadowed man, the way he had vanished into the night as silently as he had come. It was a reminder that this perfect moment was fragile, that danger circled closer than either of them could admit. She pulled back slightly, searching his eyes. "Promise me again," she whispered. "No matter what comes, you'll never let them touch us." His hands framed her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I swear it, Amelia. On everything. I have everything I am. No one touches you. No one touches them." His voice was steel wrapped in velvet, a vow that could shatter kingdoms. Her lips trembled into a smile, and she kissed him again, pouring all her trust and love into the connection. The fear didn't vanish, but it dulled beneath the certainty of his words. For tonight, she allowed herself to surrender fully, to be his without hesitation. Time seemed to blur, the moments flowing seamlessly as the night deepened. Their whispers filled the chamber, sometimes soft confessions, sometimes laughter that broke free like birds escaping a cage. He spoke of his childhood, of battles fought in silence, of the loneliness he had masked with power. She spoke of her, nights spent staring at the ceiling, afraid her sons would grow up never knowing what it meant to have someone who stood unshakably at their side. Each revelation bound them tighter, weaving their souls together in a way no ceremony or vow could. They were no longer two separate lives colliding. They were a single force, forged in fire and shadows, determined to stand against whatever the world dared throw at them. When at last exhaustion pulled at her limbs, Amelia lay in his arms, her head on his chest. His heartbeat was steady, strong, like a drum promising her safety. She traced idle patterns across his skin, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never felt this safe." He pressed a kiss to her hair, his hand stroking her back in soothing circles. "That's because you're exactly where you belong." The room was quiet save for the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of their breaths. Outside, the city glittered beneath the stars, unaware of the love story unfolding within those walls. Yet in the silence, Alexander's mind was far from rest. His thoughts kept circling back to the shadowed man, to the look in his eyes that spoke not of chance but of intent. He tightened his hold on Amelia, vowing silently that come morning he would uncover the truth. Whoever dared to stand in the path of this family would learn that Alexander Knight was not a man to be threatened. But for now, with her warmth pressed against him and her trust heavy in his arms, he allowed himself one night of peace. One night, where love triumphed over fear, and the world outside could wait. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, its glow casting a faint halo around the room. Outside, the city still pulsed with life, but within the walls of the mansion there was only stillness. Alexander lay awake, Amelia curled against him, her breathing soft and even as sleep finally claimed her. His hand rested protectively along her back, his thumb brushing her shoulder absent-mindedly. For years he had mastered the art of sleeping anywhere, through chaos, through stress, through battles that demanded every ounce of his willpower. But tonight, sleep refused him. His mind circled back again and again to that figure in the shadows, the one who had dared to appear on their wedding night. The man's silence was more unnerving than any threat spoken aloud. Alexander knew the difference between coincidence and calculated intrusion. This had been the latter. Whoever that man was, he had been there with intent, and Alexander was determined to unearth it. A sudden shift pulled him from his thoughts. Amelia stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, her brows knitting together as though her dreams weren't kind. He pressed a kiss against her hair, whispering softly, "You're safe." She quieted instantly, her body relaxing into his, and the sound of her steady breaths filled the silence once more. He allowed himself a moment, just one, to absorb the warmth of her presence, the comfort of her trust. It was a weight and a gift all at once, and he knew he could not fail her. Not now, not ever. By dawn, Alexander was already awake and dressed, moving through the quiet halls with the precision of a predator. The mansion's staff moved discreetly, preparing for the day, but none dared disturb him. His phone buzzed once, a secure line lighting up with the name of his most trusted man, Harris. "You have something for me?" Alexander's voice was low, clipped, though he stepped into the garden to avoid waking Amelia or the children. "There was someone last night, sir," Harris confirmed, his tone taut. "Security cameras caught glimpses, but he knew where to." Stand where the blind spots were. That's no coincidence. We've pulled a partial image. It's not clean, but it looks like Victor Hale. Alexander's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. Hale. The name alone was enough to stir anger in his chest. A rival from years past, ruthless, clever, and dangerous. They had crossed paths in business and beyond, each encounter leaving scars that were invisible to the world but burned deep into memory. Should I move on him? Harris asked. Not yet, Alexander said sharply. If he showed himself, it's because he wants me to know he's watching. But he miscalculated. One thing, he revealed his presence to Amelia. That means he's not here just for me. He's after what I love. His voice was steel, cold and lethal, and that will be his mistake. As he ended the call, the sound of laughter drifted through the garden. The triplets had woken early, still in their wrinkled shirts from the night before, chasing each other with wooden swords someone from the staff must have provided. Their giggles rang out, unburdened by fear, as though the world beyond their play didn't exist. Alexander watched them for a moment, an unfamiliar tightness gripping his chest. He wasn't used to protecting something so pure, so fragile. His battles had always been about power, money, control. But this was different. This was about blood and love and innocence. He swore under his breath that nothing would take that from him. Amelia appeared on the terrace soon after, wrapped in a silk robe, her hair tumbling loosely around her shoulders. Sleep still clung to her features, but when her eyes found Alexander, they softened, lighting with a quiet joy. She approached slowly, her hand brushing his arm. "You were awake before me again," she murmured. He kissed her forehead, his expression unreadable. "I had things to think about." She studied him, sensing the tension beneath his calm. "It's about last night, isn't it?" His silence was answer enough. She sighed, her fingers sliding into his hand, gripping it tightly. "I trust you, Alexander, but promise me you won't try to bear this alone. If someone threatens us, I want to know. I want to stand beside you." He looked down at her, admiration flickering in his eyes. "You're braver than you know, Amelia, but I'll do whatever it takes to keep you and them from harm, even if it means carrying the weight myself." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she leaned into his chest, her voice soft. "Then let me at least carry you." For a rare moment, Alexander allowed himself to relax, to feel the quiet strength she offered him. It was a reminder that he wasn't fighting alone anymore, and though the thought unnerved him, it also grounded him. The boys soon noticed their parents on the terrace and rushed over, wooden swords raised high. "Dad!" they cried in unison, their eyes bright with mischief. "You're under attack!" Alexander crouched instantly, feigning shock as one clung to his arm, another leaped onto his back, and the third tried valiantly to trip him. Amelia laughed, the sound like music on the morning air, as Alexander allowed himself to be toppled to the grass. "You've defeated me," he declared, letting them pin him down. "But beware, I always rise again." He scooped them up in one swift motion, spinning them until they shrieked with delight. Amelia's heart swelled at the sight, tears threatening as she whispered to herself, "This is what I always dreamed of." But as she watched him with the boys, a flicker of movement caught her eye beyond the garden gates. A man stood in the distance, just far enough to be almost unnoticeable, yet too still to be innocent. She blinked, and in the next instant, he was gone. Her smile faltered, but she said nothing, unwilling to shatter the laughter that surrounded her. Still, a chill crawled up her spine. The shadow wasn't gone. It was moving closer. And though Alexander's laughter rang out as he played with the children, a storm was already gathering at the edge of their paradise, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The laughter in the garden echoed bright and unrestrained, but Amelia's heart pulsed with unease as her eyes lingered on the spot where the figure had stood. The air was clear, the hedges trimmed and unmoving, yet she couldn't shake the certainty that someone had been there. She pressed a smile onto her lips when Alexander glanced her way, not wanting to disturb the moment, but the worry coiled tightly in her chest refused to loosen. Alexander, oblivious to her fleeting expression, lifted one of the boys onto his shoulders, while the other two clung to his legs. His deep laugh rumbled across the garden, and for a few precious seconds Amelia saw the man not as a CEO or strategist, but as a father. Strong and unyielding, willing to kneel on the grass just to share in their play. It was a sight she had once believed impossible, and the beauty of it made the threat looming at the edge of their happiness all the more unbearable. "Breakfast," the grandmother's voice called from the terrace, her cane tapping lightly against the stone tiles. "Come in, my darlings, before the eggs grow cold." The boys groaned in protest, but obeyed, dragging Alexander along with them as though they were victorious warriors parading their prize. Amelia followed, her robe brushing softly against the grass as she walked, her eyes flicking once more toward the gates. The emptiness there was deafening. Inside, the dining room was laid with elegance, silver cutlery gleaming, fresh fruit arranged in neat pyramids, and steam rising from warm platters. The boys dove eagerly into their seats, chattering over one another, while the grandmother smiled fondly at their energy. Amelia's mother, however, sat rigid at the far end of the table, her teacup balanced delicately between her fingers, her gaze sharp. Alexander pulled out a chair for Amelia before taking his place at the head of the table. He observed the scene with a quiet authority, though he let the boys' noise fill the room without interruption. Their voices rose in laughter as they debated who would be faster in a race across the estate. The grandmother clapped along, encouraging their stories, while Amelia's mother finally set her cup down with a soft clink. "You must understand," she said, her voice cool but controlled, "that what happened last night changes everything. People will talk. The press will twist it, rivals will exploit it. And now," her eyes flickered toward the triplets, "they will become targets too." The words silenced the table. The boys glanced at one another, sensing the shift, while Amelia bristled, her hand tightening around her fork. "Mother," she warned softly. Alexander, however, leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I don't need a reminder of how the world works, but I do need clarity. Are you warning me, or are you doubting me?" The mother's lips tightened. "I'm doing neither. I'm stating a fact. You've painted a target on your back more brightly than ever before. And whether you like it or not, your enemies will see these children as your weakness." "They're not my weakness," Alexander said, his tone dropping to a dangerous quiet. "They're my strength, and anyone foolish enough to test that will learn how far I'm willing to go." The grandmother's hand covered his, her touch light but firm. "Then let them talk," she said softly, her eyes shimmering with pride. "Love is always a scandal to those who've forgotten it." Amelia exhaled, grateful for the support, though her unease remained. She reached for Alexander's hand beneath the table, and he gripped it in return, grounding her. The conversation shifted as the boys chattered again, but the tension lingered, like smoke in the air. When breakfast ended, Alexander excused himself for a call. He stepped into his study, the heavy oak door closing behind him. Harris's voice greeted him on the line again, low and urgent. "Confirmation, sir. It was Victor Hale. He was on the grounds. He left no trace, but our men tracked his car leaving the area just before dawn." Alexander's jaw tightened. "What's his play?" "Unclear. But Hale doesn't waste moves. If he wanted you dead, he'd have tried already. He's circling, watching, waiting for an opening." Alexander's gaze shifted toward the door, where faint laughter from the boys seeped through. his fist clenched around the phone. "Then we close every opening, double the security. No one enters or leaves this estate without my knowledge. And Harris?" His tone dropped to ice. "If Hale comes near them again, I want him brought to me alive. He and I have unfinished business." When he returned to the hall, Emilia was waiting, her eyes searching his face. He masked his anger with practiced ease, but she knew him too well already. She stepped close, her hand brushing his arm. "It's him, isn't it?" she whispered. He didn't answer, but the silence spoke louder than words. She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "Then we can't just wait for him to strike, Alexander. You know that." He tilted her chin upward, his eyes burning with determination. "And you know me, Emilia. Waiting is not in my nature." Before she could respond, the triplets came bounding down the hall, tugging on their hands, demanding a trip into the city. Alexander froze, calculating in silence, weighing risk against desire. He looked at Emilia, her expression caught between longing for normalcy and fear for safety. Finally, he crouched to the boy's level, his hand brushing back one's messy hair. "Soon," he said firmly. "We'll go soon. But right now, Daddy has to make sure the world is safe for you first." The boys pouted, disappointed but accepting. They ran back to the grandmother, leaving Emilia and Alexander in silence. She touched his cheek, her voice trembling. "You've already taken so much on your shoulders. Don't let this destroy what we've found." He caught her hand, pressing it to his lips. "It won't destroy us, Emilia. It will make us stronger. Hale doesn't know it yet, but by stepping into our lives, he sealed his fate." Outside the tall windows, the morning sun rose higher, bright and golden, casting light into every corner of the mansion. Yet beneath that brilliance, shadows stirred unseen, drawing closer, waiting for the perfect moment to strike at the family who had only just begun to taste happiness. And though the boys laughed, and the grandmother hummed, and Emilia leaned into Alexander's steady arms, the storm's first whispers already curled at the edges of their perfect morning. The mansion hummed with an uneasy calm as the day stretched on. Outside, sunlight painted the gardens in warm hues, but within the walls, a quiet tension lingered like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. Alexander spent much of the morning behind closed doors, the sharp murmur of his voice on hushed phone, calls carrying faintly through the corridors. Emilia tried to distract herself with the boys, their laughter spilling through the halls as they built elaborate castles from blocks and blankets. Yet her mind was never far from the shadow that haunted them. By afternoon, she wandered into the library, a vast chamber lined with shelves that reached the ceiling. The scent of old paper mixed with polished wood comforted her, reminding her of childhood escapes into stories when the world outside felt too heavy. She settled into an armchair, watching the boys sprawled on the rug, their heads bent together, as they scribbled mysterious equations and sketches in their notebooks. They were geniuses, each of them, sharp-eyed, quick-tongued, and endlessly curious. Sometimes she forgot they were still children, their minds racing far ahead of their years. One of them, Daniel, the eldest by mere minutes, looked up suddenly. "Mommy," he said softly, his voice unusually serious. "Why was that man staring at us last night?" Her heart froze. She hadn't realized they'd seen him too. She forced her voice to remain calm. "What man, sweetheart?" "The one near the gate," Daniel replied. His brothers nodded in agreement. He wasn't smiling. He was just watching. Emilia's pulse raced. She crouched down beside them, brushing a curl from Daniel's forehead. "Sometimes strangers pass by, that's all. But you don't need to worry. Your father and I will always keep you safe." Daniel studied her with a penetrating look that reminded her far too much of Alexander. "But who keeps him safe?" She had no answer, only silence, before pulling all three boys into her arms. their little bodies pressed against her, warm and trusting, but the weight of their question dug deep into her chest. When Alexander finally entered, the air shifted instantly. His presence filled the room, his stride confident, his gaze sweeping over them with the precision of a man cataloging every detail. He kissed Emilia's hair before crouching beside the boys, his voice lighter now. "What's this? Another one of your secret blueprints to conquer the world?" The youngest grinned. "Not the world, just the house. We made a plan to make the kitchen ours forever." Alexander laughed, genuine and rich. A worthy battle. Yet when his eyes flicked up to Emilia's, he caught the shadow of worry she hadn't managed to conceal. He rose and gestured subtly for her to follow him. In the corridor, away from small ears, his voice dropped. "They know, don't they?" Her throat tightened. "They saw him. They asked me why he was staring. They're children, Alexander. But they're not blind." His jaw flexed, the muscle ticking. "Then it ends before it begins. I won't let Hale's shadow stretch over this family." Her hand reached for his, squeezing tightly. "Just promise me you won't drown in this. Fight. You've already given everything of yourself to the battles of your world. Don't lose yourself, now that you finally have something worth living for." He leaned close, his forehead against hers, his voice a whisper only she could hear. "On the contrary, Emilia, I finally have a reason to fight with everything I am." That night, after the boys were asleep and the household had gone quiet, Alexander stood at his study window, staring out at the moonlit grounds. His reflection glared back at him from the glass, sharp and unyielding. On the desk behind him lay a file, its pages filled with reports, images, and names connected to Victor Hale. The man had resurfaced after years in the shadows, and his timing was no accident. Alexander poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. He took a slow sip, his thoughts razor-focused. Hale had always thrived on intimidation, on creeping into lives like poison before striking. But this time, Alexander vowed, it would be different. This time he wasn't just protecting his empire, he was protecting Emilia, the boys, the grandmother whose frail hands had blessed their union. He would not allow a single crack in the fortress of their lives. The soft creak of the study door pulled him from his thoughts. Emilia stepped in, wrapped in a silk robe, her hair tumbling loosely around her shoulders. Her eyes found his instantly, reading him the way no one else ever could. She crossed the room, her bare feet silent against the carpet, and slid her arms around his waist from behind. "You're carrying it all again," she murmured against his back. He placed his hand over hers, pulling her around to face him. "It's who I am." "No," she said firmly, her gaze locking onto his. "It's who you were. But you don't have to be that man anymore. Not with me, not with them." Something broke in his expression, a flicker of vulnerability slipping past the steel. He set the glass aside and pulled her into him, kissing her with a fierceness that stole her breath. It wasn't just desire, it was desperation, devotion, the silent plea of a man terrified of losing what he had only just found. She melted against him, her fingers tangling in his hair. Her body pressed to his, as though she could fuse herself into him and shield him from everything beyond those walls. His lips trailed along her jaw, down her neck, igniting fire beneath her skin. Her whispers filled the space between them, promises of love, of strength, of forever. When at last they stilled, their foreheads pressed together, Alexander whispered, "You and those boys? You've made me human again, and that terrifies me more than anything Hale could ever do." Her hand cupped his cheek, her thumb brushing the line of his jaw. "Then let that fear make you stronger, because you're not fighting for power anymore." "Alexander, you're fighting for us." He closed his eyes. letting her words sink into the very marrow of his bones. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the quiet promise of dawn. Somewhere in the darkness, Victor. Hale was watching, waiting. But within the mansion, wrapped in Emilia's embrace, Alexander knew one truth with unshakable certainty. Whatever storm approached, he would meet it head-on, unbroken, and for the first time in his life, not alone. And though the night seemed calm, the coming days would test them in ways neither could yet imagine. The fire in the study had burned down to glowing coals by the time Alexander finally allowed Emilia to guide him away from the desk. The weight of the file on Hale still pressed against his mind, but the warmth of her hand in his steadied him in a way no document or strategy ever could. They walked together down the hall, the vast mansion hushed except for the muted tick of the grandfather clock that marked each passing second. In the quiet, Emilia spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "Do you remember the first time we argued? In that boardroom?" A corner of his mouth curved upward. "You mean the time you called me arrogant to my face and threatened to walk out of the contract?" She smiled faintly, her robe brushing against his as they moved. "I wasn't threatening. I was ready to walk." "You didn't." "No," she admitted, glancing at him from the corner of her eye. "Because even then I saw something in you, something beyond the walls you built around yourself. I think I knew deep down that you'd eventually become this." "This?" His brow arched. She stopped in the hall, pulling him to face her. Her hand rested lightly on his chest, over his heart. "A man who laughs with children, a man who kisses his wife like the world could collapse around him and he wouldn't care. A man willing to risk everything not for power, but for love." For a long moment, he said nothing, simply studied her face as though trying to memorize every line, every shade of emotion in her eyes. Then he leaned down and kissed her gently, not with urgency this time, but with reverence. When he pulled back, his voice was husky. "You make me want to live differently. But that doesn't mean I can forget who I had to be to survive. If Hale thinks he can rip this away from me, he'll find out very quickly that I am still that man when I need to be." Emilia held his gaze, understanding but unwilling to yield completely. "Then let me be the reminder of who you've become. Because you can't fight this battle with rage alone. If you do, you'll lose yourself. And us." Her words cut deeper than any warning Harris could ever deliver. He kissed her forehead before continuing down the hall, the conversation unfinished but echoing in his thoughts. The next morning dawned clear, sunlight spilling across the manicured lawns. The boys were awake early again, bursting into their parents' room with boundless energy. Alexander had barely pulled on his shirt before they were climbing onto the bed, shoving papers into his hands. "Look, Dad," Daniel announced proudly. "We made blueprints for a safe room, just in case." Alexander blinked down at the childish. Sketches, walls reinforced with impossible materials, trap doors that led to underground tunnels, even a moat filled with alligators. Despite himself, he chuckled. "Impressive, but I think Harris will have something slightly more practical in mind." Emilia, still wrapped in the sheets, gave the boys a stern but affectionate look. "You shouldn't have to think about things like this." But Daniel only shook his head. "We're not scared, Mommy. We just want to be ready." Alexander set the papers aside and drew the boy onto his lap, his expression serious. "That's my job, not yours. You three are brilliant, smarter than most men I've ever met. But I'll protect you, not the other way around." Daniel's small hand rested on his father's cheek, his gaze steady. "Even heroes need help sometimes." The words, innocent and earnest, cut through Alexander like a blade. He pressed the boy's hand to his chest, his voice quiet. "Then promise me this. You help me by never doubting that I'll keep you safe. Deal?" Daniel nodded solemnly, sealing the promise with a child's trust. Later that day, Alexander convened with Harris in the study, while Emilia and the grandmother took the boys into the gardens. Harris spread photographs across the desk, grainy images from security feeds, maps with circles drawn in red ink, names connected by lines of suspicion. At the center of it all was Victor Hale. "He's building something," Harris said grimly. "Not just a threat, but a network. Men loyal to him, money flowing in from sources we can't fully trace. It's bigger than personal revenge. He's after something larger." Alexander studied the web of information, his jaw tightening. "And he thought showing himself at my wedding would unnerve me. All he's done is give me clarity. He's no longer operating in shadows. I'll drag him into the light and end this." Harris hesitated. "With respect, sir, Emilia and the children, if you make this move too aggressively—" "I don't wait for men like Hale to strike first," Alexander cut in, his tone sharp. "If I do, he wins, and I won't allow it." Meanwhile, in the gardens, Emilia sat beneath the shade of an oak tree, her gaze lingering on the gates where she had seen the figure before. The boys raced across the grass, their laughter bright, while the grandmother hummed an old tune, her eyes closed as though soaking in the peace of the moment. Yet Emilia couldn't shake the feeling that their time like this was running out. Her mother's voice came from behind her, clipped and cool. "You should convince him to leave. Take the children and go somewhere safe. Abroad, perhaps." Emilia turned, startled to see her mother watching from the terrace. "And abandon him? Protecting those boys is more important than pride or loyalty," her mother said firmly. "You don't know the kind of men Alexander has made enemies of. If one of them is already here—" Emilia rose, her hands trembling but her voice fierce. "You don't understand. Leaving would destroy him more than any enemy could. He's not just fighting for his empire anymore, Mother. He's fighting for us. And I won't run when he needs me to stand." Her mother's eyes softened slightly, though worry still etched her features. "Then be prepared, child, because war has a way of finding its way inside even the strongest walls." As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Alexander emerged from the mansion, his expression unreadable. He watched Emilia with the boys, the scene so perfect it might have been a dream. But in his chest, the vow, hardened into steel. Hale was circling, and soon he would strike. But when he did, Alexander would be ready, not just as the ruthless man he had always been, but as a husband and father who now had everything to lose. The shadows might be closing in, but within his grasp was the only light that mattered, and he would defend it with every breath he had. The evening settled over the estate with a deceptive calm, the gardens glowing beneath lantern light, the mansion's tall windows reflecting the fading fire of the sky. From a distance, it looked like the picture of peace, a family wrapped in laughter and comfort. But inside Alexander's chest, the weight of anticipation pressed down harder with every passing hour. He had spent years dismantling men like Victor, Hale, men who thrived in darkness and fed on fear. Yet this was different. This time, Hale wasn't circling his empire. He was circling his heart. Emilia watched the boys race across the lawn, their small feet pounding against the grass as they chased one another with sticks they pretended were swords. Their laughter floated into the air like music, carrying innocence that Alexander couldn't allow to be touched. She glanced toward him, her eyes searching his face, reading the storm he tried so carefully to conceal. "You've been somewhere else all day," she murmured when she stepped close, her hand brushing against his. He didn't deny it. His gaze remained fixed on the gates at the edge of the property, where shadows thickened as night fell. "Because somewhere out there, Hale is watching, waiting. He thinks he can frighten me into mistakes." "And can he?" she asked softly. Alexander turned to her then, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "He can take nothing from me. Not as long as you stand here, not as long as they're safe." His eyes softened, but there was fire beneath them. I'm done waiting for him to strike. I'll bring the fight to him. Fear prickled at her skin, but she forced her chin up. Then let me stand beside you when you do. He kissed her, forehead, long and lingering before whispering, You already do. Later that night, the mansion grew quiet, the boys tucked into bed with their grandmother telling them gentle stories. Amelia moved through the corridors in silence, her silk gown whispering against the floor. She found Alexander in the study again, hunched over a spread of maps and documents. A single lamp lit the desk, casting sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. You're planning something, she said softly. He didn't look up. I'm tightening the circle. Harris will double the patrols. The gates will be reinforced, and tomorrow I'll start dismantling Hale's new network piece by piece. His tone was clipped, precise, the voice of the CEO who had built empires and broken rivals without blinking. But Amelia crossed to him, pressing her hand flat against the papers, forcing his attention upward. Alexander, look at me. You can't. Let him turn you into the man you swore you wouldn't be again. Not now, when everything we've built is so fragile. His eyes burned into hers, conflicted. And if I don't, if I hesitate, if I soften, if I choose love over strategy, what then? He won't hesitate. He'll strike at the heart of what I love most. Her breath hitched, but she refused to falter. Then let that love sharpen you, not harden you. Fight. Him, yes. But fight as the man who laughed with those boys this morning, not the man who used to bury himself in power and pride. Because Hale doesn't just want to destroy your empire. He wants to drag you back into the darkness you left behind. For a moment. Silence stretched thick between them, filled only by the faint crackle of the lamp's filament. Then Alexander's hand rose, covering hers on the desk, his grip firm. You think you know me better than I know myself. I do, she whispered. Something in him broke then, the mask slipping for just a heartbeat. He pulled her into his, arms holding her so tightly she could feel the tremor in his chest. If anything happens to you, to them... His voice faltered, something it almost never did. She pressed her lips to his collarbone, her whisper steady. Nothing will. Not if we face this together. Hours later, when the house was still and the world seemed asleep, Alexander found himself pacing the balcony outside their chamber. The moonlight painted the gardens silver, shadows stretching long and thin. He lit a cigar, the smoke curling. Upward into the night, his thoughts a torrent of strategy and memory. A rustle caught his attention, too deliberate, too sharp to be the wind. His instincts sharpened instantly. He set the cigar aside, his hand brushing against the pistol holstered discreetly at his side. He stepped to the railing, eyes narrowing into the darkness. There, near the far hedges, movement flickered. A figure, half shrouded by shadow, stood watching the mansion, the same stance, the same stillness as before. Victor Hale. Alexander's pulse didn't quicken, but his body coiled like a predator ready to strike. For several moments, the two men simply stared across the expanse of lawn, neither moving, neither yielding. It was a silent exchange of power, a warning, a challenge. Then, as before, Hale turned and melted into the night, leaving only silence. In his wake, Alexander's grip on the railing tightened until his knuckles whitened. He wanted to storm after him, to end it now, but something in Hale's retreat gnawed at him. This wasn't withdrawal, it was provocation. He returned inside, finding Amelia awake, her eyes wide with worry, as though she had felt the shift in the air. She sat up, clutching the sheets to her chest. Was he there again? Alexander nodded once, his jaw rigid, her lips parted, a tremor running through her. Then he won't stop until I stop him, Alexander finished, his voice cold and certain. He sat beside her on the bed, pulling her close. She buried her face into his chest, inhaling the scent of smoke and steel, her arms clutching him tightly as though afraid he might vanish. He stroked her hair, his eyes fixed on the window where the moon still glowed. "The war has begun," he murmured into the darkness, "and I will end it before it touches you." But deep inside, he knew Hale's patience was a weapon. The shadow wasn't just testing their defenses, it was waiting for the perfect crack to slip through. And that knowledge haunted Alexander, more than any open threat ever could. Yet as Amelia clung to him, as the soft breaths of the boys carried faintly from the rooms down the hall, one truth anchored him. This family, this fragile light, was worth every battle, every risk, every ounce of blood he might have to spill, and no shadow, not even Victor Hale's, would take it from him. The night dragged on with a heaviness that refused to ease. Alexander remained awake long after Amelia's breathing had steadied, lying beside her yet unable to surrender to sleep. His mind sharpened on every sound, the creak of wood, the whistle of wind through the balcony doors, the faint scuttle of branches against stone. He had lived his life expecting enemies, but never had their presence felt so dangerously close, so personal. Hale was no longer just a name in a file. He was here, circling them like a wolf that had scented blood. When dawn broke, Alexander slipped from the bed, careful not to wake Amelia. He dressed quickly, his movements precise, deliberate. By the time she stirred, he was already on the phone with Harris, issuing quiet commands. Guards doubled their posts. Surveillance equipment was upgraded and placed even in corners of the estate once deemed untouchable. He would not allow even a whisper of weakness. Yet when Amelia entered the study, still wrapped in silk and sleep, she read the iron tension in his posture instantly. "You didn't sleep," she said softly, her eyes searching his. "No," he admitted without hesitation, his tone flat. "Hale was here again, watching, testing me." Her breath caught, and though her face paled, she stepped closer, defiant against the fear that crept into her chest. "Then let me help you." His jaw clenched, his eyes hardening. "You help me by keeping them safe, by staying here, inside, where my men can protect you." Her lips trembled, but her voice remained firm. "You can put guards on every corner, Alexander, but you can't shield us from the weight of not knowing. Secrets are poison. If Hale wants to shake us, don't let him do it with silence." For a moment, his anger flared, but then he saw the truth in her eyes. She wasn't asking to step into his war recklessly. She was demanding partnership. Slowly, he exhaled, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. "Very well. But what you hear may haunt you." "Then we'll be haunted together," she whispered. Later. That morning, the triplets burst into the breakfast hall, dragging their grandmother by the hand. Their energy was boundless, as if danger hadn't touched them at all. One carried a toy plane, another clutched a makeshift sword fashioned from cardboard, and the third held a folded map scribbled with colored lines. "We're explorers today," they announced proudly, climbing into their chairs. "And Daddy's, the general." Alexander, who had been speaking quietly with Harris near the window, turned and allowed a rare smile to flicker across his face. "The general, am I?" "Yes," the youngest shouted. "You tell us where to go, and we'll conquer everything." Amelia laughed despite herself, though the sound caught faintly in her throat. Watching them, she longed for a world where this could be their only battle, pretend adventures drawn on paper. But her gaze slid to Alexander, and she saw the shadow of reality in his eyes. After breakfast, Alexander pulled Harris aside once more. "Get me everything on Hale's movements in the last 6 months. Where he's been, who he's touched, where the money flows. I don't want whispers. I want certainties." "Yes, sir," Harris replied briskly. But before he left, he hesitated. "There's one thing. Rumors, nothing more. Hale may have been building ties with someone inside your own circle, a betrayal. The words hit Alexander like a blade between the ribs. Betrayal wasn't new to him. He'd built an empire by expecting it, but the timing was precise, too precise. "Find the snake," he ordered, his voice low and lethal, "and cut off its head." While the men moved like shadows through the estate, Emilia took the boys into the library. She read to them, her voice soft, though her mind wandered. She couldn't stop picturing the figure by the gates, the silent challenge in his stance. Even as the boys curled against her, warm and innocent, she knew that safety was a fragile illusion. By evening, Alexander returned to her side, his hand resting lightly on her back as though anchoring her in place. "I need you to trust me," he murmured, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. "I do," she replied instantly. His eyes searched hers, dark and stormy. "Then trust that I will end this before it touches you. Hale won't win." Not this time. But Emilia's fear wasn't of Hale winning. It was of Alexander losing himself in the process. She remembered the stories whispered about him in hushed tones, the ruthless deals, the empire built on strategy and fire. That man had been feared, untouchable, cold. She had fallen in love with the man behind that mask, the man who held her, sons on his shoulders, and kissed her like she was his salvation. If Hale forced Alexander back into the darkness, would there be anything left of the man she had given her heart to? That night, the mansion was restless. Guards paced with heavier steps, radios crackled more often, and the air hummed with tension. Emilia lay awake, listening to every sound, her hand clutching the sheets. When Alexander finally slipped into bed, she turned to him, whispering, "Do you ever wonder if we were too bold? If standing together like this only made us a bigger target?" His hand found hers in the dark, his grip unyielding. "No," he said firmly. "We didn't make ourselves targets. We made ourselves unbreakable, and that terrifies men like Hale." His confidence steadied her, though not entirely. She buried her face against his chest, listening to the steady thrum of his heartbeat. It was strong, unrelenting, yet beneath it she felt the strain of a man preparing for war. And somewhere beyond the gates, Victor Hale was surely smiling in the shadows, savoring the tension, the fear, the cracks he believed he was creating. But what Hale didn't yet understand was that this family wasn't fragile glass waiting to shatter. They were steel being forged in fire, and when the moment came, it would not be Alexander alone who stood against him. It would be all of them, bound by love, strengthened by trust, and unwilling to surrender, no matter what storm raged, outside the walls of their home. The night deepened, the kind of quiet that pressed heavily against the glass panes of the mansion's windows. The boys were asleep in their wing of the house, their breathing soft and even, while the grandmother dozed in her armchair with a shawl draped across her shoulders. Emilia sat at the edge of the bed, her robe slipping from one shoulder as she stared out into the darkness, her thoughts restless. The image of the shadowed figure by the gate replayed over and over in her mind, each time colder, more menacing. Alexander entered silently, his tie undone, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He looked like a man who had walked through fire and hadn't decided yet whether he'd been burned. Emilia turned toward him, her eyes searching his face. "Another call?" she asked softly. "Harris," he admitted, pouring himself a glass of water. "He's certain now. Hale has men moving through the city. They're not striking yet, but they're watching, gathering. He's circling like a vulture waiting for weakness." "And do you feel weak?" Her voice trembled only slightly. Alexander set the glass down, crossing to her in 2 long strides. His hand cupped her jaw, tilting her face up to his. "Never," he said firmly. "Not when you're here. Not when they're here." But she saw the flicker of weariness in his eyes, the shadow of old battles resurfacing. She reached up, her hand covering his. "Promise me one thing. Don't shut us out. If this storm is coming, let me stand in it with you." His lips brushed hers, lingering as he whispered, "Then hold on, Amelia, because storms don't frighten me. They remind me what I have to protect." Later, when she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, Alexander returned to his study. The room smelled faintly of smoke and leather, the lamp casting a harsh pool of light over the desk. Documents sprawled across the surface, maps, photographs, bank records, all threads of Hale's web. Alexander leaned forward, his elbows braced. On the desk, eyes sharp as blades. He circled one name in red ink, Marcus Vale, a trusted associate, or so he had thought. Harris's intelligence suggested otherwise. Funds diverted. Meetings unaccounted for. Whispered conversations with men tied to Hale's network. Betrayal. The pen in Alexander's hand snapped between his fingers, the sound sharp in the silence. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, forcing control back into his veins. Rage could not guide him, not now. Strategy would. Hale expected fury. He would give him precision instead. A soft knock broke the silence. The door creaked open, and the eldest triplet, Daniel, peeked in, rubbing. His eyes. His hair was a tousled mess, his small feet bare against the polished floor. "Dad?" he whispered. Alexander rose immediately, crossing the room to scoop him up. "What are you doing awake at this hour?" he asked, his voice gentler than Amelia ever heard during the day. "I had a dream," Daniel mumbled, resting his head on Alexander's shoulder. "You were fighting a man in the dark, and he wanted to take us away." Alexander froze, his chest tightening. He pressed a kiss to the boy's hair, steadying his voice. "Dreams can't hurt you, and no one is taking you away. Do you believe me?" Daniel's sleepy eyes lifted, serious despite his age. "Yes, because you don't break promises." The words sank deep, both a comfort and a weight. Alexander carried him back to bed, tucking him beneath the covers while his brothers stirred but didn't wake. He stood there for a moment, watching, their small bodies curled together, their innocence radiating in the moonlight. In that instant, the war with Hale wasn't about business or power anymore. It was about these boys, about Amelia, about a future he refused to let anyone steal. When he returned to the study, Harris was waiting, his expression grim. "I didn't want to disturb you, but there's news. One of Hale's men was spotted near the docks. We believe they're moving weapons." Alexander's face hardened. "Then Hale isn't circling anymore. He's preparing." "What do you want done?" "Send a message," Alexander ordered coldly. "Make it clear that if he touches this city, if he even breathes too close to my family, I'll erase every name connected to him, one by one." Harris nodded, but his eyes lingered on him. "You're ready to go to war." Alexander's jaw tightened. "I've been at war my whole life. The difference is now I have something worth winning for." As dawn approached, Amelia awoke to find Alexander standing once again at the balcony, the pale light of morning washing over him. She slipped behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. He didn't turn, but he placed his hand over hers, grounding himself in her touch. "Will it ever end?" she asked quietly, her cheek pressed against his back. "Yes," he said after a pause. "When Hale is gone, and when no one else dares to think they can touch what's mine." His words were fierce, yet beneath them she heard the fragility of a man balancing between love and vengeance. She held him tighter, whispering into the dawn, "Then let love be the reason you fight, Alexander. Not rage. Love is what makes you unstoppable." He closed his eyes, her words echoing in his mind. The sun rose higher, spilling gold across the estate. Somewhere beyond, Hale moved his pieces into place, convinced he was tightening the noose. But Alexander Knight was no man's prey. He would turn Hale's game against him. And when the final move came, it would not be Hale watching. From the shadows, it would be Alexander, standing in the light with his family behind him and his enemy at his feet. Yet even as he vowed it silently, he knew the days ahead would demand more than cunning. They would demand sacrifice. And though he would give everything he had to protect them, a part of him feared the cost might be higher than even he imagined. The sun lifted higher, gilding the mansion's stone walls in light, but the brightness only seemed to sharpen the edges of Alexander's thoughts. He stood on the balcony long after Amelia drifted back to the children, his eyes scanning the grounds as if he could force Hale to appear by sheer will. The gardens stretched in immaculate symmetry, the hedges trimmed, the fountains glittering with fresh morning spray. To anyone else, it was a paradise. To him, it was a battlefield waiting to be breached. By mid-morning, the triplets had pulled him into their orbit again. They stormed into the study with the determination only children could carry, armed with papers, crayons, and one very crooked cardboard shield. "We're making defenses," one of them declared, "in case the bad man comes." Alexander set aside the report he was reading and crouched down, meeting them at eye level. "Defenses, huh? And what do they look like?" They spread their drawings across the carpet. Towers built from blocks, hidden tunnels under the house, even a drawbridge sketched in bright red. Alexander studied them with surprising seriousness, nodding as though reviewing blueprints from his own architects. "Impressive," he said. "You've thought of everything." Daniel, the eldest, crossed his arms. "Almost everything. We don't have the weapons, but we don't want weapons. We want brains." Alexander's lips twitched. "Good, because brains win battles long before swords are drawn." He ruffled the boy's hair, though his gaze hardened faintly. The innocence of their plans cut deeper than any dagger. They shouldn't have to think of threats at all. But Hale had already stolen that piece. Later, Amelia found him in the garden while the boys played tag under the trees. She slipped her hand into his, her eyes still carrying the same worry that had haunted her since the wedding night. "You're trying to make it look easy for them," she whispered, watching the children's laughter. He didn't deny it. "They need to believe in safety even if I have to construct it with smoke and mirrors. But you can't build a fortress on illusions." Her tone was gentle, not accusing. "If Hale comes and the boys see the walls crumble, they won't," Alexander cut in, sharper than intended. Then he softened, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "I won't let them." She searched his face, the shadows beneath his eyes, the tension pulling at the lines of his mouth. "You're fighting on every side, Alexander. Business, enemies, even your own past. Don't let it eat you alive before Hale even strikes." For the first time that morning, he smiled faintly, though it was heavy with exhaustion. "You think I'm fragile? I think you're human," she said simply. The words lingered with him long after she returned to the house. Human. He had spent years erasing that part of himself, carving out the softness until all that remained was steel. Yet Amelia, with her fire and her gentleness, had dragged humanity back into his bones. It terrified him and gave him more strength than he'd ever known. By afternoon, Harris returned with an update. He laid a folder on the desk, his expression taut. "It's confirmed, sir. Marcus Vale has been in contact with Hale. Funds moved offshore, private meetings in neutral zones. He's feeding him information." Alexander's jaw locked. Vale had been close, a confidant, an advisor he had trusted through storms others had fled. Betrayal wasn't new, but betrayal from within cut like poison. "How deep?" Alexander asked. "Deep enough," Harris replied grimly. "He knows your schedules, your weaknesses. He may even know about Amelia and the children." For a moment, silence pressed like a blade to the throat. Then Alexander straightened, his voice low. and lethal. Bring him to me, quietly, tonight. Harris nodded once and slipped out. When night fell, Emilia sensed something had shifted. Alexander was colder, sharper, his movements precise and purposeful. He barely touched his dinner, his mind already consumed by the confrontation to come. The boys noticed, too, their laughter dimming as they watched him. Finally, Daniel asked, "Why do you look like you're going to war?" Alexander knelt, his hand firm on the boy's shoulder. "Because sometimes, to protect the people you love, you have to be sharper than the shadows. But you don't need to worry. The war is mine, not yours." Daniel tilted his head, thoughtful. "Then win fast, so you can laugh again." The words pierced him, simple and pure, yet heavier than any command. Later, after Emilia had tucked the boys in, she found Alexander dressing in black, his movements efficient, her chest tightened. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling though she fought to steady it. "Ending this before it begins," he said without turning, sliding his cufflinks into place. "You mean confronting him. I mean cutting out the rot before it spreads." His eyes met hers then, burning with the steel she had always known but hoped never to see again. Her hand caught his arm, desperate. "Don't let this change you back into the man you were before me. Promise me that when you walk into this, you remember who you are now." He pulled her close, kissing her fiercely, almost desperately. "I remember. You, them. You're carved into me now. Hale can't take that away. No one can." She wanted to believe him, wanted to cling to the strength of his words, but the shadow of fear lingered. As he left the room, the echo of his footsteps down the hall felt like the beginning of something irreversible. The mansion's walls seemed to shiver as the hours passed. Emilia lay awake, her ears straining for every sound. Somewhere far off, in the city, Alexander was moving through the darkness, hunting betrayal, confronting shadows. She clutched the sheets, whispering silent prayers not just for his safety, but for the man she loved to return whole. And beyond the estate's gates, unseen by her, unseen even by Alexander's guards, Victor Hale watched from the safety of distance, his lips curling into a smile. He wanted this. He wanted Alexander drawn back into the darkness, forced into choices that would cost him pieces of his soul. Because Hale knew, sometimes victory didn't come from killing a man. It came from watching him destroy himself. The city was alive, with its usual nighttime rhythm, cars humming on distant avenues, neon lights blinking against the darkness, the faint thrum of life in every shadowed alley. But for Alexander, the city wasn't a living organism tonight. It was a hunting ground. He sat in the back of a sleek black car, his reflection sharp in the tinted window as Harris drove them toward a derelict warehouse at the edge of the docks. His mind was steel, but deep inside, a thread of fire burned hotter than any strategy. Marcus Vale's betrayal. When they arrived, the air reeked of salt and rust. Harris led him through the iron doors, where two guards stood watch over a chair, bolted to the floor. Marcus sat bound, his once polished suit rumpled, his face pale in the harsh light. He looked up as Alexander entered, and for a moment shame flickered across his features. "Alexander," Marcus began, his voice cracking, "you have to understand." "Understand?" Alexander's tone was low, dangerous. He stepped closer, each word cutting through the silence like a blade. "I trusted you. I built this empire with men like you at my side, and while my back was turned, you opened the gates to Hale." Marcus shook his head desperately. "You don't know him like I do. He's not just one man anymore. He's an army, Alexander. I tried to protect myself by selling me out." The words landed heavy, final. Marcus faltered, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. Alexander leaned in, his eyes cold fire. "You should have feared me more than him. Silence stretched. Then Alexander straightened, turning his back. Harris, strip him of everything. His accounts, his connections, his name. He walks out of here with nothing but his skin. That will be punishment enough. Marcus sagged with relief, tears springing to his eyes. Thank you, Alexander. Don't thank me. Alexander's voice was sharper than any knife. Pray you never cross me again, because if you do, mercy won't be in my vocabulary. He left the warehouse without another glance, the night air hitting his face like ice. Harris followed, silent but watchful. The car door closed behind Alexander, and as they pulled away, he stared out at the water, the city lights reflecting like broken glass. He had cut Marcus down without blood, but the ache in his chest told him the wound was still personal. Back at the mansion, Amelia paced the length of their chamber. Every tick of the clock stretched her nerves tighter. Every creak of the house pulled her eyes toward the door. When at last she heard footsteps, she rushed forward. Alexander entered, his shoulders broad with tension, the smell of smoke and steel still clinging to him. You're back, she breathed, relief flooding her features. He caught her in his arms instantly, burying his face in her hair. For a long moment he simply held her, his heart pounding against her cheek. It's done, he murmured. She leaned back, her eyes searching his face. But is it over? He hesitated, the pause enough to answer her question. No, he admitted. Marcus was only a pawn. Hale's still moving his pieces. Her hand rose to his cheek, her thumb brushing the stubble there. Then promise me something. Promise me you won't lose yourself while you fight him. He kissed her deeply, his hand cradling the back of her head. I won't, because you're my anchor, and every time I look at those boys, I know exactly who I'm fighting for. The next day, the mansion seemed alive with a strange, uneasy energy. Guards moved more visibly now, stationed near windows and gates. The boys noticed, of course. They noticed everything. Daniel cornered his father in the library, his small arms crossed, his gaze sharp with intelligence beyond his years. You caught him, didn't you? Daniel asked. Alexander crouched, meeting his son's eyes. Caught who? The man who was helping the bad one, Daniel said simply. We heard the guards talking. Alexander studied him for a long moment before nodding. Yes, but I didn't need to fight him. Sometimes the smartest move is to let your enemy destroy himself. Daniel's mouth quirked into a small, knowing smile. That's what I drew in my plan. He darted off to show his brothers, leaving Alexander staring after him with a swell of both pride and unease. That evening, the family gathered for dinner. The grandmother's laughter filled the room as the boys recounted their battle plans, and even Amelia smiled, though shadows lingered in her eyes. Alexander watched them all, memorizing the glow of the chandelier over Amelia's hair, the way the boys leaned against one another, the way his grandmother's eyes softened every time she looked at him. This was his fortress, not the walls or the guards, but the people at this table. And that was exactly why Hale would target it. Later, after the boys had been tucked into bed, Alexander stood once more on the balcony. The night air was cooler, carrying the scent of rain. Amelia joined him, slipping her hand into his. You're waiting for him, she said quietly. Yes, Alexander admitted. But he's patient. He wants me restless. He wants me to unravel before he makes his move. She turned to him, her eyes fierce. Then don't give him what he wants. Show him that no matter how long he waits, you'll still be here, stronger than before. He kissed her gently, his lips lingering against hers as though sealing the vow into the very fabric of the night. But as they held each other, unseen from the shadows beyond the gates, Victor Hale watched once more. His smile was sharp, almost amused as he whispered into the phone at his ear. He's holding on too, tightly. When I pull, he'll break. The rain began to fall in soft sheets, tapping against the windows of the mansion, blurring the glass like tears. Inside, Alexander and Amelia clung to one another, unaware that Hale had already set the next stage of his game into motion, and this time, he wasn't coming for Alexander's empire. He was coming for his heart. The rain turned heavier through the night, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. The mansion, usually a place of quiet strength, felt caged in by the storm. Alexander stood at the wide glass doors of the study, his silhouette cut sharply against the lightning that split the sky. His reflection looked like another man staring back at him, hard, unyielding, almost unrecognizable from the one Emilia had coaxed back to life. Behind him, the fire had burned low, casting the room in a dim orange glow. Harris entered without, knocking, his face grim, water dripping from the shoulders of his coat. "It's begun," he said simply. Alexander turned, his voice steady. "What's begun?" Harris set a folder on the desk, flipping it open to reveal grainy photographs taken just hours before. A convoy of black cars, men unloading crates into an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. "Hale's weapons have arrived. We..." Intercepted chatter. "He's recruiting. Mercenaries, not businessmen. He's preparing for something big." Alexander's eyes narrowed, scanning the photographs. "And he wants me to know. That's why he shows himself. That's why he lingers at my gates. It isn't just intimidation. It's strategy. He wants me restless, second-guessing." "And is it working?" Harris asked carefully. Alexander looked back at the rain-lashed windows, his reflection flickering with each flash of lightning. "No. If Hale wants a war, I'll end it before he can strike. Assemble the team. I want that. Factory mapped, every entry, every escape. By tomorrow night, I want him cornered." Harris nodded, but before leaving, he hesitated. "And Amelia?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "She'll be safe here. I'll make sure of it." When Harris left, Alexander lingered in the silence. His hand pressed flat against the glass as the storm roared outside. He knew Hale was watching, knew he was savoring the anticipation, but he also knew something else. Hale had underestimated him. This wasn't about business anymore. It was about blood and family, and Alexander had no intention of losing either. Upstairs, Amelia stirred restlessly in their bed. When Alexander finally joined her, she sat up, her eyes shadowed by worry. "Harris was here," she whispered. "Something's happening." He sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on her knee, his voice low but firm. "Hale is moving faster. He's building an army." Fear flickered across her face, but she lifted her chin. "Then what will you do?" "What I've always done," Alexander replied. "Strike before he does." Her hand caught his, gripping tightly. "And what if you don't come back?" He turned to her then, his gaze fierce, unwavering. "I will, because I have to. For you. For them." He kissed her deeply, pulling her into his arms as though the world outside no longer existed. Her hands clung to him, her lips desperate against his. And for a moment, the storm outside was drowned out by the storm within them. But when she finally fell asleep, her head on his chest, Alexander's eyes remained open, fixed on the ceiling. He was a man who had won every battle by preparing for the worst. And in the deepest part of his mind, he knew Hale would not just come for him with bullets or knives. Hale would come for his heart, for the very thing that made him human again. The following evening, the mansion was alive with tension. Guards moved with urgency, radios crackled more frequently, and the boys sensed the unease despite the games Amelia tried to weave around them. Daniel, the sharpest of the three, confronted his mother in the library. "Something's wrong," he said, his small voice cutting through the quiet. "Everyone's whispering. Even Dad." Emilia knelt, pulling him into her arms, though her own heart raced. Sometimes grown-ups have to fix problems that children don't need to carry. Daniel leaned back, his serious gaze too old for his years. But we're part of this family. Doesn't that mean we carry it too? Her eyes burned with tears, but she kissed his forehead. It means you carry the light. You don't need to carry the shadows. That night, Alexander prepared to leave with Harris. Amelia met him in the corridor, her robe brushing against the marble floor. "Take me with you," she said suddenly, her voice trembling but resolute. No. His refusal was sharp, immediate. "I can't sit here and wait while you walk into danger. You need me." "What I need," Alexander said, gripping her shoulders, "is to know you're here, guarding their world while I protect ours. If Hale thinks he can touch you, he's already won. Do you understand?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded, pressing her forehead to his chest. He kissed her hair once, lingering, before pulling away and disappearing into the storm with Harris at his side. The factory loomed in the distance, its broken windows glowing faintly with the light of activity inside. Men moved in and out, shadows against the metal walls. Alexander crouched behind cover, his eyes scanning the scene with surgical precision. "This is it," Harris whispered. Alexander's gaze hardened. "No, this is the beginning." Back at the mansion, Amelia sat in the boys' room, watching them sleep. Their faces were serene, untouched by the dangers pressing against their world. She brushed back a curl from the youngest's forehead, her chest aching. A noise shattered the quiet. The faint creak of a door, the whisper of footsteps where none should be. Her body tensed, her heart hammering. Slowly she rose, slipping into the corridor. The mansion was dark, silent, but for the storm outside. Then she saw it. The faint outline of a figure at the far end of the hall, standing too still, too deliberate. Her breath caught. Victor Hale was inside, and with Alexander miles away, the storm had finally breached their walls. Amelia's hand flew to her mouth, stifling the gasp that threatened to tear from her throat. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly between her and the figure standing at the far end. Lightning flared outside the tall windows, illuminating him for just an instant. Victor Hale, sharp-featured, calm as a predator, his lips curved in the faintest of smiles. Her first instinct was to run to the boys' room, to throw herself across them like a shield. But she knew Hale would expect panic. Her heart thundered, but she forced herself to stand still, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want?" His reply was smooth, deliberate, carrying easily through the silence. Only to see what has made Alexander so human. His eyes gleamed as he stepped forward, each stride unhurried, his presence filling the corridor like smoke. "You must be Amelia!" She steadied herself, clutching the fabric of her robe in white-knuckled fists. "You don't belong here. Leave. Before—" "Before what?" he interrupted, his voice silk-laced with steel. "Before your husband finds out? He already knows I'll come. He just doesn't know when. Or how." Another step, and he was closer now, close enough that she caught the faint scent of rain clinging to his coat. "Do you know what the difference between Alexander and me is?" he asked, tilting his head. "He builds walls to protect what he loves. I burn walls down to prove they never mattered." Fear coiled in her stomach, but she lifted her chin, refusing to cower. "If you think you can break him by coming after us, you don't understand him at all. You'll only make him stronger." Hale's smile deepened, though his eyes remained cold. "We'll see." Before he could take another step, a small voice pierced the tension. "Mommy?" Amelia's blood froze. She turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway of the boys' room, his hair tousled from sleep, his eyes wide as they flicked to the stranger in the hall. "Who's that?" "Go back inside," Amelia said quickly, her voice trembling but firm. "Now." But Hale's gaze lingered on the child, his smile turning into something sharper, more dangerous. "Ah." The prodigies. Emilia's heart pounded. She stepped directly in front of Daniel, her arms spread as if her body alone could stop the storm bearing down on them. "Don't you dare!" For the first time, Hale's composure cracked, his eyes narrowing. "You're braver than I expected." He leaned closer, his voice a whisper laced with venom. "But bravery is only valuable if it doesn't get you killed." At that moment, the sound of rushing footsteps thundered down the hall. Guards appeared from the stairwell, weapons raised, shouts breaking the suffocating silence. Hale straightened, unbothered, his smile returning as if he had orchestrated the entire encounter. "Until next time," he said softly, before stepping back into the shadows. By the time the guards reached the corridor, he was gone. Emilia clutched Daniel to her chest, her breath ragged, her entire body shaking. The boy's small arms wrapped tightly around her, his voice muffled against her robe. "I wasn't scared, Mommy, I wasn't." But she knew he had been, and so had she. When Alexander returned hours later, soaked from the storm and furious from a mission cut short, Harris broke the news to him in the study. He was here, inside the mansion. The glass Alexander held shattered in his fist, shards cutting into his palm unnoticed as rage poured through him. Inside, his voice was a low growl, more dangerous than a scream. Yes. He confronted Emilia. Alexander's world narrowed to a pinpoint. He stormed from the study, finding Emilia in the boy's room. She sat on the bed, her arms wrapped around all three children, her face pale but calm. When her eyes met his, he saw the truth without words. He knelt before her, his bloody hand cupping her face. "Tell me," he demanded, his voice shaking with fury he could barely contain. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't falter. "He stood in our home, Alexander. He looked at them, at me. He wanted me to know he could walk through your walls whenever he pleased." Alexander's chest heaved, his pulse a drumbeat of fire. "Then I'll burn every path he has to ash." Emilia pressed her forehead against his, her voice breaking. "Just promise me you won't lose yourself in the fire." He held her, tightly, his arms crushing her against him as though he could fuse her into his very soul. But in his eyes, the storm raged. Hale had crossed the threshold, touched the sanctity of his family. That wasn't provocation anymore. It was war declared. The next morning, the estate was a fortress. Reinforcements doubled, barriers erected, every inch of the grounds swept and secured. Yet Alexander knew it wouldn't be enough. Hale had slipped through once, and he would again. In the library, Daniel sat quietly at the desk, scribbling in his notebook while his brothers played nearby. When Alexander approached, the boy looked up, his eyes serious. "He wasn't afraid of the guards," Daniel said simply. Alexander crouched beside him. "Then I'll give him something to fear." Daniel's small hand touched his father's arm. "Don't just fight him, Dad. Outsmart him. That's what we would do." Alexander stared at his son, pride and sorrow mingling in his chest. He kissed the boy's forehead before rising. "You're right. And that's exactly what I'll do." That night, Alexander stood once more on the balcony, the storm gone, but the air still heavy with tension. He looked out over the city, his voice, low, meant only for the shadows he knew were listening. "You wanted a war, Hale. Now you'll have it. But you'll learn too late. I don't fight to win. I fight to destroy." And somewhere in the city, Victor Hale smiled, as though he had been waiting for that declaration all along. The storm that Hale had dragged into their lives reached its breaking point on a night when the city itself seemed to hold its breath. The mansion was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a fortress braced for war. Every window was watched, every gate reinforced, every path patrolled. Yet Alexander knew Hale would not strike with bullets alone. He was a man of shadows, and shadows were not stopped by walls. The final confrontation came not in whispers but in fire. Hale revealed himself at last, his mercenaries surrounding the outskirts of the estate, their silhouettes cutting against the floodlights. The boys had been taken deep into the hidden rooms Alexander never thought he would have to use, the grandmother's trembling hands clutching them close. Emilia stood with Alexander in the grand hall, refusing to leave his side despite his pleas. "I won't run," she said, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. "If you fall, I fall with you." Hale's voice carried through the night when he stepped into the courtyard, his calmness chilling. "You built an empire of iron, Alexander. But love is fragile, and fragile things break." Alexander stepped forward, his presence like a blade unsheathed, his voice sharp as steel. "You miscalculated, Hale. Love doesn't break. It reforges a man into something unstoppable. You came here thinking you'd find weakness, but tonight, you'll find only your end." The battle was swift and merciless. Alexander's men clashed. With Hale's mercenaries, steel against fire, shadows against light. Harris fought like a storm at his side, loyal to the last breath. Bullets tore through the night, shouts and screams echoing across the grounds, but in the center of it all stood Alexander, unyielding. Hale himself entered the fray, his calm demeanor twisting into a predator's snarl. Their confrontation was not business. It was primal. Fists met flesh, blood slicked the marble, and the air burned with the weight of two titans colliding. Hale fought like a man with nothing to lose. Alexander fought like a man with everything to protect. Emilia's eyes never left him. Her hands clenched, her lips whispering silent prayers as the two men battled like gods in the stormlight. At the height of it, when Hale pressed his blade against Alexander's throat, sneering, "Even lions bleed," Alexander's voice thundered back, low and unshaken. "But lions don't bow." With a surge of strength born not from rage but from love, he turned the tide. The blade fell, clattering across the marble, and Hale was driven to his knees. For the first time, fear flickered in Victor Hale's eyes. "Kill me, and you prove I was right. You're nothing but a monster hiding behind your family." Alexander's chest heaved, his bloodied hands steady as he raised his weapon. But his gaze shifted, finding Emilia standing behind him, her eyes wet with tears yet fierce with love. He saw his sons in his mind, Daniel's brilliant defiance, the younger one's laughter, and he realized Hale was wrong. He wasn't a monster. He was a man remade by love, reforged by the fire of family. He lowered the weapon. "No, Hale, I don't need to kill you to win. You've already lost, because you'll never understand the strength of what I have." Guards surged forward, binding Hale in chains, dragging him from the hall as he screamed empty threats into the night. The storm outside broke into silence, the crack of thunder replaced by the sound of rain washing the blood from the courtyard stones. Alexander turned to Emilia, his body battered, his shirt torn, his hands still shaking from the fight. She ran to him, throwing herself into his arms, her sobs muffled against his chest. "You came back to me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Always," he murmured, pressing his lips to her hair. "Because you are the reason I fight, and they—" He glanced upward where he knew the boys waited hidden, "are the reason I will never fall." The triplets burst into the hall moments later, rushing toward their father, their small arms wrapping around him with desperate strength. "We knew you'd win, Dad," one cried. "We weren't scared," shouted another, though his tears betrayed him. Alexander knelt, gathering them all against him, his heart breaking open at the purity of their trust. "You don't need to be brave for me," he said softly. "I'll be brave for all of you." The grandmother approached slowly, her cane tapping softly against the floor, her eyes glistening. "Tonight," she said, her voice quivering with pride, "you didn't just save them, you saved yourself." Emilia cupped his face, her lips trembling into a smile. "You proved Hale wrong. You proved me right. Love didn't weaken you. It made you invincible. Alexander pulled her close, his forehead pressed against hers, his voice fierce with devotion. From this night on, there is no empire greater than this family. No throne higher than your love. No crown heavier than being theirs. The rain eased, moonlight breaking through the clouds to bathe the mansion in silver light. The air smelled of new beginnings, of battles won not just with fists, but with hearts. The city beyond might whisper about the war between Alexander Knight and Victor Hale, but within those walls, the truth was clear. It wasn't Alexander the CEO who triumphed. It was Alexander the husband, the father, the man who had found in love a power no rival could ever touch. And as Amelia leaned into his embrace, the boys clinging to them both, and the grandmother smiled through her tears, Alexander lifted his gaze to the night sky. The storm had passed, but its memory carved a vow into his soul. Nothing would ever threaten what they had built again. For in the end, Hale was right about one thing. Love was fragile. But Alexander had proven something greater. When protected, fiercely, when fought for without fear, love could be stronger than steel, fiercer than fire, and more unbreakable than any empire man had ever built.